Welcome to today's second debate on this very timely and important topic. And this debate is entitled, Should there be a firewall between FDA regulatory policy and drug costs? This issue has become increasingly crucial due to growing concerns about medicine access and affordability for patients. Today's debate will explore whether maintaining a clear boundary between regulatory oversight and drug costs is the best approach, or if a more connected framework could address challenges in making medications accessible to those who need them. So Scott, on my right, will be taking the proposition or affirmative position in this Oxford-style debate, arguing for a strict firewall between FDA regulatory policy and drug costs. And Josh Sharfstein, to my left, will be taking the opposition or negative position in this Oxford-style debate, arguing against a strict firewall between FDA regulatory policy and drug costs. I am going to quickly introduce the speakers and then provide the ground rules. So firstly, for Josh Sharfstein is Vice Dean for Public Health and Community Engagement, Director of the Bloomberg American Health Initiative, and a Professor of the Practice in Health Policy and Management. Previously, he served as a Secretary of the Maryland Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, the Principal Deputy Commissioner of the FDA, Commissioner of Health for Baltimore City, and as a health policy advisor for the Congressman Henry A. Waxman. He is an elected member of the National Academy of Medicine and the National Academy of Public Administration. And on my right, Scott Gottlieb served as the 23rd Commissioner of the FDA from 2017 to 19 under President Trump. He is a strong supporter in private sector innovation as a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, a partner at the CV firm NEA, and a board member of several private sector companies. Scott continues to publish and speak out on a broad range of topics, including his 2021 book on the rise of COVID-19, regulatory strategies for disruptive technologies, and the use of LLMs in clinical practice, and much more. So I am going to start with you, Scott. You get 6 minutes to make your case. Go to you, Josh, 6 minutes to make your case. A 1-minute rebuttal going back to you, Scott, then to you, Josh. Then if there's time, we'll open it up for questions, and then be ready to vote on which you agree with. Scott, 6 minutes, start.
Well, thanks for the introduction. Look, we've opened a door to this when I was at FDA, and even before that, when we thought about trying to involve CMS more in decision-making around the approval of medical devices and give them a seat at the table on the design of clinical trials, on the presumption that there was an impediment to getting a lot of medical devices reimbursed, and if clinical trials for medical devices reflected more of the payer's prerogatives, it might be a more seamless route to the market for those devices. And in fact, industry was agitating for this change. And I will tell you that the experience with this was a largely unhappy experience. The feedback that we would get from CMS around the design of clinical trials was oftentimes unrealistic. There was a presumption or a feeling, at least on my part, that CMS lacked the expertise in clinical trial design to really give thoughtful input on how those trials should be modified. And you ended up with a lot of unrealistic expectations. And I want to just sort of focus on 4 domains. I learned a lesson never to say I'm going to say 3 things after watching Rick Perry in the presidential debates from 8 years ago. But I'm going to say 4 things, and I've written them down so I won't forget what the 4th one is. The first is that I think if we went into this domain where reimbursement authorities had a seat at the table in the design of clinical trials, it's going to add a lot of complexity and cost to the clinical trials. You're going to see longer and larger trials. And you're largely answering commercial questions in that context. You're not answering questions about the safety and the benefits of the products necessarily. You're introducing different kinds of prerogatives. That's not what the FDA's mandate is. So you're taking the FDA outside the scope of its mandate, and you're embracing much longer or larger trials. Now, sponsors are doing that anyway. They're doing a lot of pre-approval development work so they can get a more seamless route to the market and a more seamless route to reimbursement. We're seeing clinical development programs start to increase, but that's something that's happening voluntarily because of the complexities of the reimbursement landscape. And if you start to mandate that, I think you're going to have a much more difficult route to the market. The second, and I touched on this, is that CMS just isn't adept at clinical trial design. And you see coverage of evidence development, for example, where CMS imposes post-approval requirements routinely get amended because the trials that they implement aren't realistic in a practical setting, can't be completed. it's not as easy as hiring a bunch of clinical trialists inside CMS. Those people who have that discrete expertise are hard to find, they're hard to recruit, they're certainly going to be hard to retain. I think it's CMS, which doesn't have the same culture as FDA, and FDA also struggles with people who have a lot of experience in these domains, getting them to come in and work inside the agency. The third is that the coverage decisions, in my view, are inherently policy decisions and they're political decisions. And this is reflected in the fact that a lot of reimbursement decisions get arbitrated inside the administrator's office at CMS. So you would never see an approval decision coming up for some kind of evaluation by the commissioner at FDA. This never happened. I mean, I was occasionally briefed on pre-approval decisions when we knew there was going to be certain kinds of political complexity to it, or it's going to be something that garnered a lot of public attention where I would have to be out defending the decision on behalf of the agency. But the idea that a decision would come up to the commissioner's office and the commissioner would actually weigh in on the decision, I don't think that ever happened in my entire experience at the agency, and I think probably Rob and others would reflect the same. This routinely happened at CMS, and you routinely had Congress and other political leaders weighing in on coverage decisions. And so I think the more that you start to encroach the regulatory process with those kinds of coverage determinations, the more you're going to see politics start to enter into and policy considerations start to enter into these approval decisions in a way that we've been able to maintain a much more, I think, pristine sort of edifice around the regulatory approval process. And the final point I would just make is that the statute that CMS has to adhere to around reasonable, necessary is itself a squishy standard. Safety and efficacy is a very clear standard. The standards that FDA uses, I think, are very objective and becoming even more objective from the work that CDER has been doing to try to create more quantitative assessments around those decisions. But reasonable and necessary is inherently a squishy standard. And the more, again, that you start to put those kinds of considerations into the approval process, the more that I think you're going to get a lot of uncertainty around what the decision making is and how the FDA is weighing those kinds of considerations. And so the idea of having separate agencies with separate standards, one that's very objective around safety and benefits and risk benefit, and one that is inherently more subjective and takes into consideration more of a population-wide benefit and value to the consumer. I think keeping those two considerations separate, there's a lot of value in that inherently for patients and for the marketplace. And final point, at the end of the day, decisions around coverage and whether something's reasonable for a population is a consideration best determined in real-world settings. And that's what you're seeing payers start to do. Make limited introductions of new products and continue to collect information in practical settings to find out which populations truly are benefiting from a product, where something can provide maximal value. That's certainly the ethos of the coverage with evidence development process, which Mark McClellan helped pioneer when he was at CMS more than 20 years ago. And I think by and large it's working. And so the idea of migrating that earlier in the process and incorporating it into the market entry of a product, I think inevitably is just going to deny patients needed therapies.
Scott, thank you very much. And for the record, I counted 5 points. So Josh, we'll now move to you for the opposition or negative position. You're arguing there should not be a firewall between FDA regulatory policy and drug costs. Josh.
Great, thank you. I'd like to take us back to June 11th, 2009. That's the day Dr. Margaret Hamburg and I published a piece in the New England Journal of Medicine on what it means for FDA to be a public health agency. And the key paragraph was, the Institute of Medicine has defined the mission of public health as fulfilling society's interest in assuring the conditions in which people can be healthy. To be healthy, people need access to innovative, safe, and effective medical products. The FDA's job is to support this access, and in doing so, to promote health, prevent illness, and prolong life. If you agree with me that FDA is a public health agency, then FDA must be concerned about high drug costs that reduce access to innovative, safe, and effective medications. 1 in 3 Americans in fall of 2024 said they don't take their medicines or skip doses because of the costs. 1 in 3 Americans. Now, before I go further, let me say I don't think that costs should be a factor in the core drug approval standards of FDA. There's safety, effectiveness, and cost. They're separate, and the decision on whether a drug's benefits exceed the risk is not about cost. But that doesn't mean FDA regulatory policy should be separate from cost. And I've got my four ways that FDA can consider a cost in regulatory policy. And I promise, even though I am an academic, that I will quote, I'm not going to quote from myself again. Okay. From here on in, I'm only going to be quoting Scott. Okay. So, example one, improving generic competition. Generic drugs save the healthcare system trillions of dollars. Just 1 year of approvals, according to FDA, saved $19 billion. One path for FDA to consider pricing and regulatory policy is to prioritize approving more generic drugs, especially where there's limited competition or high prices. To quote a former FDA commissioner, FDA should, quote, facilitate increased competition in the market for prescription drugs through the approval of lower-cost generic medications. Under Scott's leadership, FDA published a list of off-patent, off-exclusivity branded drugs without approved generics and implemented a new policy to expedite the review of generic drug applications where competition is limited. FDA can do more, including clarifying standards for more complex generics, using pricing information to bump applications to the front of the queue, and in extreme cases where price gouging limits access, declaring an effective shortage, permitting importation of high-quality generic drugs from other countries. If the courts don't permit that, FDA should seek explicit authority from Congress to proceed. I'm looking at you, Martin Shkreli, who I think might be back there. I don't know. Okay. Number two, reducing patent gaming. About a year ago, a law professor here in San Francisco, Robin Feldman, estimated that delays in generic entry cost the healthcare system $53.6 billion in 2019. There was once an FDA commissioner who was really frustrated by these games. In an interview with Kaiser Health News, this FDA commissioner said that gaming the system, quote, to try to block competition was a big issue. On Scott's watch, to his credit, FDA launched a website that named the companies that blocked generic companies from getting brand name product samples. And there's a lot more that FDA can do in this regard, including using its data to call out abuses of the patent system and working with lawmakers to end them. This is really important for the system set up by the Hatch-Waxman Act, or as those of us who work for Henry Waxman called it, the Waxman-Hatch Act. Path three, reforming accelerated approvals. I support accelerated approval, a pathway that provides access to promising medications when there's suggestive but not definitive evidence of effectiveness, while definitive evidence is being collected. But you have to do accelerated approval well, which means not only the scientific question of picking the right medicines and the moment to do this, but also the policy question of assuring the timely completion of definitive studies. These drugs can be quite expensive, burdening patients in the healthcare system. Medicare spends more than $1 billion a year for accelerated approval drugs. So improving accelerated approval, including learning the lessons of the past failures, being more clear about FDA's standards, ensuring the industry's timely completion of studies, will have the effect of lowering drug costs. There are bipartisan policy ideas that could be considered, including capping the payment rate for Part B drugs and biologics under accelerated approval, as MedPAC proposed in 2023, echoing a 2019 piece co-authored by the late and great Gail Walensky. Now, I don't have a Scott Gottlieb quote on this one because I think he might not share my view, but I think that on this kind of reform should be on the table based on how the latest changes to the accelerated approval program play out to make sure we're getting definitive evidence and not overcharging Americans for drugs that prove not to work. Example 4, sharing data with payers. Really appreciated the last discussion of transparency. FDA should make its analyses and underlying data as a matter of regulatory policy more open and accessible to payers, permitting health economists to use the data for assessments about the value of drugs and to design value-based payment arrangements that make it possible for more patients to get the drugs they need and to fulfill the public health mandate of FDA. There was once an FDA commissioner who was very interested in transparency, telling Politico that the agency should be, quote, looking broadly at the information we have from a public health perspective that would be useful to the public. Scott, I would humbly submit that helping others address the high cost of prescription drugs is one really important reason for greater transparency, and FDA can at least catch up to other regulators in making information available about prescription drugs. And you heard there's a lot of interest at the FDA in doing that. We've done a lot of legal reviews. The FDA has a lot of authority to redefine what is commercially confidential and could use it. I'm running out of time. Those are my 4 examples, but the list is not exhaustive. We could talk about other things too. So I'm going to conclude where I started, this time quoting from an FDA commissioner who is also a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, who said in his very first remarks to FDA staff, quote, "Too many consumers are priced out of the medications they need." Scott, you were right. The FDA should care about the fact that people can't afford prescription drugs, that costs are a big problem. To advance public health, FDA should take pricing into account in appropriate ways in its regulatory policy. Thank you.
Josh, thank you. And in the 150 years of the Oxford debate, it's well known that goading one's opponent is an accepted strategy and encouraged. But whether goaded or not, you have a 1-minute rebuttal. So, yeah, Scott, I now hand it back to you.
I spend so much time on Twitter these days. It's been a long time since I saw myself quoted accurately. Look, I think that there's absolutely a role for FDA in trying to create more competition in the marketplace, and that competition ultimately is going to help facilitate more access and more competition that's going to lower prices. And we were very attuned to that. The FDA continues to be very attuned to that prerogative. I know Josh was attuned to that prerogative. What we're talking about here is allowing payers, commercial interests to influence the FDA approval process and the requirements imposed on sponsors as a way to get data that can help them make commercial decisions. And at the end of the day, there's enough pressures in the marketplace that are going to compel the formation of that data. You're seeing CMS more and more empowered, now having the authority to set prices and negotiate prices. Certainly commercial payers are reluctant to put new drugs on formularies. And so they have a lot of tools in their toolbox to compel drug manufacturers to try to generate data that's going to help them inform their coverage decisions, and in fact are doing that. I think if you embed that in the regulatory process, inherently what you're going to get is a longer, more complex regulatory process that's going to have components to it that are not going to be easily interpretable to sponsors that are trying to gain that initial market entry. And at the end of the day, these prices don't get set, they get negotiated. Now, we may not like the tools of negotiation, the fact that discounts are in the form of rebates that don't benefit consumers, but the reality is that these prices are getting negotiated in the marketplace based on data that the payers are collecting, that the sponsors are generating on behalf of the commercial entities, and to try to embed that in the approval process, where you're going to get is not better informed utilization of drugs. You're going to get less drugs. You're going to get a costlier regulatory process where sponsors ultimately need to spend more R&D dollars on fewer bets and less opportunities for patients.
Great. Josh.
Great. So I'm not going to spend too much time being a stickler on the debate, but if you believe there's a firewall, then there is nothing. There is no consideration of drug costs and regulatory policy. But if you believe that any of the ideas that I threw forward are worthwhile, then there's no firewall. It means that you have to reject the debate topic. But I'm going to take Scott's issue here, which is CMS working with FDA on the design of clinical trials. Again, I don't think the debate hinges on it, but it's a really interesting question. And I appreciate the point that he's making, that if you had requirements and allowed everyone from CMS to pile in the room and say all the different things they wanted, it could really complicate the drug approval process, and it sounds like a terrible idea. And I also appreciate that there are things that have been tried. But it is conceivable to me, especially for device companies, which have had a very hard time getting reimbursement for certain products, that it might make sense to keep trying and to at least give an option voluntarily to companies to consider locking in CMS on a reimbursement decision early on. And to his point that it could make trials larger and more complex, I think that's a risk, but you could let the companies make that decision. And allowing that discussion to happen still is allowing is breaching the firewall. The second, that CMS is not that adept at trial design and needs to recruit better people. I would just point out CMS is located in Baltimore, one of America's greatest cities, and you can recruit some really great people to Baltimore. And I would also say that CMS could do different kinds of academic partnerships to bring in that kind of expertise. Number three, he said coverage decisions are particularly political, and the CMS, number four was CMS statute is kind of squishy, and I appreciate that, but I do think that FDA has a lot to teach CMS here. I think one of the strengths of FDA is its regulatory review, and one of the reasons that Scott or I, when I was at FDA, was not involved in regulatory decisions is because this is all really baked pretty early on with the companies. And if you were to do something similar with CMS and give that option, it would be much harder for CMS to have a political coverage decision at the end.
All right, great. So Scott was arguing the status quo, so I gave you 2 extra minutes, Josh, on the rebuttal.
What's that?
You got 2 extra minutes on the rebuttal.
I did?
By the way, yeah, you got 4 minutes. Scott
Well,
got
he's
2.
an academic, so.
Oh, that's all right, all right. Well, but I say that because I'm not going to be able to live up to my promise of a Q&A by the audience. I'm trying to pin that on you,
Okay.
Josh.
All right.
So, all right, I mean, huge thanks, Scott. You're arguing the status quo here. You believe that the marketplace should set price. You believe that it would be inefficient if we broke down the firewall that currently exists, and you don't think that the expertise exists. Josh, you have. I mean, to be fair, it's a harder argument because it's not the status quo. It's where you think we should go. And you actually used Scott's arguments to argue your case, which is absolutely brilliant. And you really believe that we can actually generate this partnership between CMS and FDA to achieve our goal. So with that said, we're going to vote. And we're not voting to see who debated better here today. You could, during the break, you can corner your favorite debater and tell them that you thought that they were a better debater or not. But you have your own opinions, and hopefully your opinions were shaped by what you heard from the debaters. So let's say there should be a firewall. That's what I want everybody to raise their hand if you believe there should be a firewall between FDA regulatory policy and drug costs. Scott's position. Raise your hand. Hi, okay. Great. And then on the flip side, there should not be a firewall between the two. It's pretty close, actually. I would say it's split about 50-50, but maybe 51% says there should not be a firewall. So thank you to Scott. Thank you to Josh.